I used to believe that if I worked hard enough, if I put in more effort than anyone else, then my true worth would eventually be recognized. That belief stayed with me through the many years I spent at NovaTech, a high-profile tech company famous for its emotional marketing. The name Hafu had once been tied to award-winning campaigns, record-breaking revenue surges, and multi-million-dollar contracts that no one believed were possible at first. I did not just work for NovaTech. I lived for it. I arrived earlier than the required time, stayed later than the last lights. I was the first to sign on to a project plan when the whole meeting room was still lost in uncertainty. And I was the last to leave after every product launch. That company was my youth, my ambition, and the place where I believed genuine relationships could be built, a place where the trust lost in the outside world could somehow be healed. Carla Rivera was one of the biggest clients I had ever managed, a demanding partner, but also the only one who had ever looked me in the eye and said, "I chose you because you make me believe." Together we launched the Feel Alive campaign to nationwide success, transforming NovaTech from a modest name into the face of emotional marketing. I had poured almost all of my heart and countless lonely nights into those projects, but there were things I could not see while I was too busy chasing success. I did not notice the averted glances in meetings, the stiff nods whenever I reported results, the praise directed at others for work I had built with my own hands. I did not notice how I was gradually left out of important meetings, or how internal announcements began forgetting to mention my name in the credits. I kept thinking it was just an oversight, a small mistake, a test of patience I needed to overcome. The day the truth came, it arrived in a single cold message. It was a Friday afternoon, and I had just set my coffee cup on the table when a notification blinked on my phone. No greeting, no explanation, just one line: "You do not need to come back anymore." I read and reread that message, hoping to find some hint that I was misunderstanding it, but there was none. The coffee before me grew cold faster than I could react. The chill from the marble table seeped through my wrist and spread to my chest, making me feel as if I were slowly sinking without anyone noticing. It was former manager, the person who had once brought me onto NovaTech's strategic team, the one who had toasted with me at year-end parties, who had sent that message. There was no face-to-face meeting, no farewell, not even the slightest signal that I was about to be removed from the place I had called home for 7 years. I opened my laptop to check my company email. My account was still active, my name still listed as project lead, and next week's meeting agenda still had me down as the keynote speaker. Everything appeared normal, except I was no longer part of that picture. I held my familiar employee badge, feeling the thin layer of plastic turn cold in my palm like an invisible hand had just stripped away my trust. Betrayal does not always come from those who oppose you. Sometimes it comes from the ones who once walked beside you through the storms. I recalled the sleepless nights spent at the office, mapping out each step of the campaign with Carla Rivera. I remembered the 2 a.m. messages of encouragement when contracts were on the verge of collapse and only my faith kept them alive. I remembered the sparkle in the CEO's eyes when I was nominated for the strategic director shortlist, and the forced smile of the HR director when she handed me my appointment letter, only to withdraw it a month later without a word. The truth arrived late, but when it came, it swept away every illusion. I discovered that for the past year, my plans had been quietly transferred to another team. The project plans I had written through sleepless nights had been turned into internal documentation, but the person presenting them was a newly hired junior strategist. She was a young woman with bright eyes and a confident voice who had never once worked on a brief with me. I did not blame her. I only wondered when real value had become so easily replaceable. I typed my name into the project system. Nothing. My name had been erased from every internal group, every meeting schedule, every client plan. There were no emails, no notes, no messages left for me. I had vanished as if I had never existed. This loss had no blood, but it hurt in a unique way, like tiny cuts accumulated until I could no longer feel the shape of myself. I closed my laptop, my hand resting on the familiar soft leather cover of the planning notebook I had used since my first day. I had once dreamed of stepping onto a stage, receiving an award for the Feel Alive campaign, smiling as they called my name among the applause. But now, all that remained was a strange emptiness inside my chest where my trust had once lived. I stepped out of the cafe, letting the gusts of wind lash my face, cutting into the palm that gripped the strap of my bag. The sun was shining that day, yet I felt like I was walking through an invisible rain. Each step was a beat of denial, a touch of the truth that I had been betrayed, cast aside from the very game I had helped to build. I wandered aimlessly through familiar streets, each corner like a dagger reminding me of the time spent in team meetings, the desperate rushes to meet deadlines, the trust I had given away without asking for anything more than simple recognition. That night, I did not go home immediately. I walked to the old NovaTech headquarters, where I had once stayed up through the first nights, dreaming of turning it into a leading innovation hub. The building now had only a few scattered lights in the windows, like distant memories of a trust that had once been so real. I stood silently, looking through the glass, seeing my blurred reflection, its edges no longer distinct, much like my place within that company. This was not just about losing a job. It was the collapse of a part of who I was. I realized then that I had spent too much time building a life around a dream that was never truly mine. I had placed my faith in hands that were never warm enough, trusted promises that had no signatures. And now, having lost everything, I was not only without a job, I had lost the image of myself that I once thought was invincible. I had lost the meaning behind all those years. I stood there for a long time, letting the memories crash over me like waves, each one heavier than the last, until my heart grew numb. And in that final moment before turning away, I whispered to myself, "This is not the end. This is only the first crack, a crack that will change everything." The first morning after receiving that message, I woke up to a profound emptiness. There was no longer the sound of an alarm clock, no meetings awaiting me on the calendar, no endless emails demanding status updates. The room was lit by sunlight filtering through the thin curtains. But inside me, it was darker than ever. I sat by the window, holding a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, watching the unfamiliar people rush by outside, and asked myself who I was without NovaTech to define me. Part of me wanted to disappear, to abandon everything and let the days drift by like a ghost. But another part, small yet persistent, whispered that this was not the end. If my true value depended solely on the recognition of an old company, then perhaps it had never truly been value at all. I opened my laptop, not to check emails, but to revisit the documents I had once written, the strategies I had once built, the ideas that had been taken and carried by others' names, the old files, which once seemed like remnants of a betrayed past, now became proof that I had once created something truly meaningful. I quietly backed them up onto a personal drive, naming the folder Proof of Process as a reminder that no matter how hard they tried to erase my traces, there would always be a part that belonged to me and only me. At first, it felt like a way to comfort myself. But as time passed, I realized I needed more than that. I needed the truth to be preserved. I needed to rebuild from the very foundation I had laid, not for revenge, at least not yet, but because I refused to let silence define me. I needed to act, but this time, act quietly. In the days that followed, I found myself walking more often, not because I wanted to exercise or chase some healthy lifestyle. I needed movement. I needed the feeling that my feet could still touch the ground, that my mind was still clear enough to think. The familiar streets now felt foreign, but in their strangeness, I found a new space to rearrange the shattered pieces of my thoughts. I bought a new notebook with a plain black cover, no logo, no name, just empty white pages inviting a different beginning. On the first page, I wrote a single line, begin with the truth. Once calm enough, I started reviewing all the professional relationships I had built. Not everyone had turned their back on me. I remembered Carla Rivera, who had once sent me a thank you message at midnight after a successful presentation. I thought about a few former clients who had privately messaged me to express their gratitude for my dedication. Without going through any management hierarchy, I did not call them immediately. I simply sat down, wrote down each name, each bond that had been built on sincerity rather than tactics. I knew that in this game, some trust would be lost forever, but some still remained, just waiting to be rekindled. One evening, while flipping through old project drafts, I found the proposal for the Revive campaign that had once been rejected without explanation. It was a project I had nurtured the longest, had invested the most heart into, yet had never been given a chance to launch. They once told me the market was not ready, that my ideas were too emotional, too focused on feelings instead of immediate profit. But now, rereading each line of notes, I realized perhaps that was exactly why it had the power to endure in a world racing after numbers. Maybe sincerity was the rare thing that could make a brand last. I began sketching out my plan, not loudly, not publicly, just small notes in my notebook, simple mind maps on my laptop, quiet evenings spent at a corner cafe where no one knew my name. The goal was not immediate retaliation. It was not about lawsuits or public accusations. It was about preparing for a comeback, a quiet yet undeniable resurgence, built upon true value, a proof that what was stolen could be rebuilt, stronger and more beautiful. But the journey was not easy. When I started reaching out to former contacts, I realized many of them had changed their numbers, switched emails, or worse, remained silent. A few responded, their words cautious and polite. I did not blame them. The world operates on interests, and someone like me, at that moment, was no longer a worthwhile investment. I simply nodded to myself, quietly grateful for the clarity. At least now, I knew where I stood. The height of the test came one morning when I received an email from the old company, demanding the return of all issued equipment, accompanied by a gentle reminder that I had signed a confidentiality agreement and that any related documents must be deleted immediately. There was no inquiry about my well-being, no sign of even minimal respect for someone who had dedicated nearly a decade of their youth. I read that email over and over in silence, feeling more sharply than ever the cold indifference of a system that viewed people as mere tools. I did not respond right away. I spent the entire morning sitting on a park bench, surrounded by the laughter of children and the blinding sunshine that felt like a cruel joke. To think it through, I knew I could not fight on the battlefield they had prepared. I had no great assets, no army of lawyers, no network of powerful connections, but I had patience, and I had the truth. The truth that, for all those years, I had been the one silently shouldering the weight of successful campaigns, patching failed plans, salvaging deals teetering on the edge, And that truth, if told in the right way, would be more valuable than any legal document. So I chose to walk a different path. I set up a separate account to archive my personal work records, leaving no links to the old company. I moved all my work evidence there, categorizing them by project, by timeline, by confirmation emails, by presentation files, by signed contracts, not to threaten, not for immediate revenge, but to protect the true value of my contributions from being distorted. That night, I reopened the list of people who once believed in me, next to Carla Rivera's name. I marked 3 others, clients who had personally thanked me after successful projects. I knew that if even one of them was willing to listen, I could start again, not from hatred, but from dignity. I reminded myself, betrayal is not the end. It is only a test, a lesson in distinguishing real light from fleeting illusions. I had walked out of NovaTech with nothing in my hands, but also with no illusions clouding my sight. And sometimes, losing everything is what finally makes you light enough to soar. There are moments when, even without warning, your silence alone can cause a tremor. I realized this during the first week after I quietly began reaching out to my former contacts. One afternoon, as sunlight slanted through the cafe window where I was sitting, the tea in front of me long since cold, my phone vibrated. It was not spam, nor a meaningless greeting, but an email from Carla Rivera, with the subject line as heavy as stone. Hafu, we need to talk. I opened the email, reading the terse yet tense words. Carla requested a private, confidential call, outside all internal communication channels. In that instant, I knew something inside NovaTech had begun to crack. I replied promptly, not hurriedly, but with enough swiftness to show I was ready. We scheduled the call for the next morning, and I spent that entire night sitting by an open window, letting the wind carry away the last remnants of anxiety, sharpening my mind like a blade that had been honed long enough. The call began with a heavy silence. Carla did not waste time. She said bluntly that recently, NovaTech's team had repeatedly missed deadlines, sent delayed project updates, and worse, the new campaigns lacked the spirit that once made clients trust without question. I no longer feel the life in every move, Carla confessed, and I understood she was referring to the emotional marketing I had once woven into every heartbeat of her brand. But Carla brought even bigger news. She had discovered that many of NovaTech's internal documents presented to partners were copied versions of my original drafts, merely altered with new titles and stripped of the author's name. More than that, several KPI reports sent to clients had been manipulated to hide the real decline in engagement and revenue. I listened to every word without once interrupting. The anger inside me did not erupt like a fire. It hardened, cold and unyielding, like a sheet of ice cracking. Carla asked, very gently, whether I could provide her with the original proof of the campaigns I had personally led. I understood what her question meant. It was not just about comparing documents, but about reconstructing the entire truth, to distinguish who truly created value and who simply fed off the work of others. I agreed without hesitation. I sent Carla the original files, handwritten notes, internal schedules complete with timestamps proving that every idea had come from me. When I pressed send, I knew a door had been opened, not for me to step through, but for the truth to flood in like a tide. 2 days later, rumors began to ripple through the marketing world. One of NovaTech's largest clients, Carla Rivera herself, had requested a full audit of all active contracts. It did not take much imagination to guess the shockwave this sent through NovaTech's management. I received a message from an old friend in the finance department, brief but telling, looks like they are starting to pay the price. I did not reply. I simply closed my notebook, feeling my heartbeat slow and steady, like a racer who had crossed the longest stretch of road. But the twist did not stop there. Just a few days later, former manager, the one who had coldly fired me by text, was summoned to an emergency board meeting. The official reason was to account for mishandling client data and the sudden drop in client retention metrics. One morning, while sipping hot tea by the cafe window, I happened upon a post on an industry forum reporting that NovaTech had just lost 2 more major contracts within a week. The clients did not stage loud exits. They simply sent quiet emails stating they would not renew. For those who understood the workings of this industry, that was a silent death sentence. The next wave of collapse came like an unstoppable undercurrent. An anonymous article surfaced on a marketing forum, accusing NovaTech of manipulating data reports and, more damningly, of silently eliminating key personnel who had originally built the company's early success, replacing them with a more controllable team. No names were mentioned, but anyone familiar with the situation knew exactly who was being referenced. I did not write that article. I did not need to. Once the truth is exposed, it knows how to find its own way. At the same time, I received a call from friend in legal, the friend who had once promised to help if I ever needed legal support. She told me she had heard about NovaTech's situation and offered to help me officially secure the intellectual property rights for the campaigns I had created, free of charge. I thanked her but declined. I did not need lawsuits to reclaim justice. I only needed results. I needed the silent helplessness of those who once dismissed me. Meanwhile, NovaTech's internal structure was unraveling. The HR director, the one who had quietly withdrawn my appointment without a word, abruptly resigned without notice. On LinkedIn, there was only a cold update seeking new opportunities. No words of thanks, no farewell post. Other senior staff began posting their own job openings separately, no longer committed to staying. Friends told me the NovaTech board was holding continuous emergency meetings, but no one could patch the widening cracks anymore. What I had not expected was that the former CEO, once a symbol of power in the company, was also preparing to step down. Leaked information suggested he would resign quietly to avoid triggering a shareholder backlash, but no matter how silent they tried to be, the truth continued to bleed out day by day. Business indicators plummeted. Market reputation suffered heavy damage. Loyal customers, those who had once proudly collaborated with NovaTech, now quietly turned away, seeking out smaller, more genuine companies. Amid all this chaos, I remained silent. I did not reply to messages from old colleagues. I did not join any discussions on social media. I made no statements and posted no cryptic updates. I let my absence speak for itself. And strangely, that absence resonated louder than any defense I could have mounted. What I had built with all my heart had become the biggest void NovaTech could not fill. They had thought that by removing me, they could claim the value I had created, but they forgot that true value does not reside in documents or titles. It lies in trust, and once trust is broken, no marketing campaign can ever repair it. I sat quietly in my familiar cafe corner, watching the city shift under the nightlights, and I knew the first storm had passed. Without anger, without retaliation, I had begun restoring myself, step by step, in a silence they had never anticipated, and this was only the beginning. There are moments, however small, that carry the weight of an entirely new chapter. I realized this on a Monday morning, when I opened my eyes and no longer felt a sharp pain in my chest. The apartment was as quiet as every other day, but this time the silence was no longer a void. It was a foundation on which I could build something new, not just an extension of the pain from the old company. I made myself a cup of hot tea, sat at the table, opened my laptop. But this time, it was not to search for news about NovaTech. I opened a completely blank page. A plan began to take shape, clear and steady, like the surface of a lake after a storm. I knew that simply walking away from NovaTech and living quietly would be no different from abandoning my true value. The days of betrayal were not just an ending. They were a test to see if I had the courage to start again from nothing. I flipped through the black notebook where I had once scribbled desperate notes. Today, I began filling it with detailed ideas, no longer scattered thoughts, but clear headings: product strategy, brand positioning, lists of potential clients, a true rebirth plan. I decided to open a small agency specializing in emotional marketing, the very thing NovaTech once half-heartedly pursued and then lost. I would build a model not based on glitter, not based on gimmicks, but on real relationships, on trust that had once been broken, on stories that truly touch people's hearts. I chose the simplest name for my company, just 3 letters from my own name, no fancy logo, no loud slogan, only a short promise in the company profile: we believe in real value, when filling out the business registration. My hand trembled slightly, not out of fear, but from the full realization that this time, no one else would be responsible for me but myself. There would be no safety net from a large corporation, no title to shield me, only a person named Hafu, standing accountable for her own dreams. But starting a business needed more than belief. It required patience and wisdom. I could not compete with budgets, fame, or a large team. I could only compete with sincerity and a deep understanding of each client. I decided to start with the relationships that had remained intact. I drafted a very simple email, sending it to 5 people whom I had trusted and who had once trusted me. The email contained only a few lines, with no persuasion, no lengthy explanations, just a quiet invitation. I am building something new, small but genuine. If you would like to hear more, I am ready to listen to your needs first. 4 out of 5 responded within 24 hours in the first conversations. I did not mention contracts or services. I simply listened. I listened to their frustrations with large marketing firms, to stories of campaigns that looked grand but lacked real value, to empty emotional slogans they had been forced to pay for. I took careful notes, not just recording what they needed, but capturing the desires they had yet to find the words for. Among them was Carla Rivera. She called me one rainy evening, her voice deep and curt as always. "Hafu, I will not renew with NovaTech. I want to see what you are building." That simple sentence became the key that opened the first door on my comeback journey. But the biggest turning point did not come from a simple yes. It came from an unexpected event. One morning, while sketching a proposal for Carla, I received a message from friend from finance, the old friend still at NovaTech. The message was short: "Hafu, they are looking for you." I did not understand at first, but when I checked my personal email, I found an offer from NovaTech itself. The sender was not former manager or HR director, but a new name I did not recognize, introducing themselves as the acting director of project restructuring. The email invited me to discuss the possibility of becoming an external consultant for a few image recovery campaigns. I did not need to ask to know what had happened. After Carla and several major clients left, NovaTech had started collapsing faster than they could contain. What was once their pride had become a burden, because no one left on their new team could connect to the heart of clients the way I once had. When emotional marketing became a survival necessity instead of a nice-to-have, they finally realized what they had lost could not be bought back with money. I did not reply immediately. I took 2 days to think, not because I hesitated, but because I wanted to ensure every decision from now on came from a place of calm, not from pain. I sat in my small kitchen, beside a cup of cooling tea, watching the pale yellow light flood through the window, and knew I was ready, not ready to return to them, but ready to step into this world as a version of myself that no longer needed validation from anyone. I composed a brief reply. Thank you for your invitation. At this time, I am focusing on a personal project and have no plans for external collaboration. Wishing you success. I did not sign with any title, did not attach a portfolio, did not mention the past. I left them with the very void they had created themselves, a void that could not be filled with anything hollow. That evening, I reopened the profile for my small company, edited the service descriptions, and added a new section, Brand Recovery Strategies Built on Authentic Emotions. I knew then that I was no longer just building a business for myself. I was creating a space where forgotten values could be nurtured and grow. 1 week later, Carla signed a contract with me. No bidding process, no intermediaries. She sent a simple message, I trust you. Those 3 words, after all the months of betrayal, dismissal, and stolen credit, meant more than any $1 million deal ever could. That night, I lit a small candle, not to celebrate, but to mark the moment, to mark the day I truly returned, not as someone begging for a chance, but as someone creating opportunities. The candle flickered slightly in the soft breeze, but I did not. I had become steady enough to understand that a spectacular comeback does not need noise. It only needs certainty, perseverance, and the quiet strength of those who have once hit rock bottom, stood up, and continued walking, without needing anyone to witness. There are victories that do not echo with cheers, that are not honored on grand stages, but simply appear in quiet moments when you look back on the road you have traveled and realize you no longer have anything left to prove. That morning, I sat in my small office, just a simple rented room on the 3rd floor of an old building, the sunlight slanting through the window and shining on the first contracts I had signed under my own name. There were no longer brand posters plastered across the walls, no slogans drawn in red ink reminding everyone to sell more. Here, there was only silence and the honest words of the emotional marketing strategies I was writing, line by line, without embellishment or pretense. My first client, Carla Rivera, had transferred her company's entire New Year campaign budget for me to manage after her. 2 other partners quietly left NovaTech and found their way to me. They did not publicly accuse anyone. They did not display their disappointment, but by withdrawing their business. They showed that strong relationships are always built on trust, not on lengthy contracts. Projects began one after another. There were no grand openings, no flashy marketing teams, only direct meetings, firm handshakes, and eyes that looked straight without hesitation. I worked harder than ever before, but this time not to prove myself to some superior, nor to chase after distant expectations. Every campaign I designed began with a simple question: what do we truly want the customer to feel? There were no grandstanding reports, no disguised numbers, only results. And the results spoke for themselves before I even noticed. The campaigns I led started to spread. Small brands that had once been forgotten began to breathe again. Conversion rates steadily improved. Customer retention indicators visibly rose. I did not need to send promotional emails. Stories of success spread naturally, like a refreshing breeze across a market, too stifled by gimmicks and emptiness. NovaTech, meanwhile, could no longer maintain its facade. News of their downfall spread quickly across the industry. unfinished projects, major clients quietly leaving. Complaints about a lack of creativity and rigid working methods began surfacing more frequently on professional forums. The former manager, who had once signed the decision to remove me from the project, had now left the company in silence. There was no farewell gathering, no thank you email, only a cold update on his personal profile, seeking new opportunities. I did not feel triumphant, sitting before that news. I only let out a quiet sigh, not out of regret, but out of understanding. Sometimes, the price to be paid does not need to come from your own hand. It comes from the very choices they made when they turned their backs on true value. A company that once led by emotional marketing had, by losing the person who created that emotion, lost its soul as well. One afternoon, while reviewing campaign schedules, I received an email from a familiar address. It was from friend from finance, the old friend who had messaged me during the early days of NovaTech's collapse. In the email, she shared that the company's internal structure had almost completely unraveled. Teams worked separately. Strategic meetings had become repetitive exercises in meaningless slogans. New clients were cautious. Old clients were distant. She said that many people in the company had begun to whisper my name, not as someone they had worked alongside, but as an opportunity they had missed. I closed my laptop without replying, because I knew, once true value is disregarded, collapse is only a matter of time. In the days that followed, I focused all my energy on what I was building. I organized small workshops with clients, where every team member had the chance to voice their true feelings about the brand. I moved forward step by step, steadily, without rushing or chasing trends. One of the principles I set for my company was, never sell what you do not believe in. It sounds simple, but in a world where everything can be bought with fake reputation, it is one of the hardest things to uphold. And it was precisely that which made the difference in the campaigns I led. The clearest sign of a spectacular comeback did not come from news articles or awards. It came one morning when I received an invitation to speak at an industry conference on emotional marketing. The person inviting me was none other than Carla Rivera. Now, as the keynote speaker, she wanted me to share about the journey of building a brand based on sincerity, not a story of revenge, not a story of defeating anyone, simply the journey of rediscovering true value in a world full of falsehoods. I stood on that small stage, the lights not too blinding, but enough for me to see the faces below, the eyes that shone not because I was famous, but because I brought something they could believe in. I did not mention NovaTech. I did not talk about betrayal, dismissal, or stolen credit. I spoke only about how easily trust can be lost and how painstakingly it must be rebuilt, not with flashy slogans, but with small, consistent actions every day. When I stepped down from the stage, I realized I no longer felt heavy. No more bitterness, no more resentment, only a deep calm, like a traveler finally finding shelter after a long journey, a place where there was no need to prove anything, no need to ask for permission, only the need to continue living true to oneself. That day, I returned to my small office, looking at the projects that were continuing to grow, and understood that true success does not lie in defeating those who once turned their backs on you. True success is standing strong on your own and watching those who doubted you face the consequences of their own choices. I opened my old notebook, turning to the last page where I had once written the first line during the darkest days, begin with the truth. Below that, I wrote a new line, end with peace. I knew that somewhere out there, people might still try to retell the old story in ways that served them, still try to build new walls to cover the void they left behind. But I no longer needed to be there to prove anything or to fix what they had broken. I had moved on, rebuilt from the ruins, with my own hands, my heart, and even the wounds that had once seemed unhealable. As the afternoon light stretched long across the window frame, I put down my pen, closed the notebook, and silently asked myself, perhaps the most wonderful thing is not to win a battle, but to find yourself after being lost so many times. I did not need anyone to answer. I already had the answer in the steady silence I had built within myself.